This week's reading of Torah is in Genesis and known as Miketz. Miketz Shenatayim Yamim. It was at the end of 2 years. Just for those of us who may not recall what took place in last week's reading, but there was Joseph again, now in a dungeon, going from one place to another, going from the frying pan into the fire, and somehow going through all of these different, what we call Gilgulim, reincarnation. I mean, it just doesn't seem to end. First, as we know, that Joseph was sold by his brothers in last week's section. Then he came into the household of one known as Potiphar, and there the wife of Potiphar desired to seduce Joseph, and so he winds up in a dungeon. And so he has supposedly no respite, really no peace and tranquility. However, Scripture records somehow another twist, very specifically, another twist to Joseph's revolving from one disaster supposedly to another. But what does it say specifically in each of these instances? When he was sold into slavery to these people, Potiphar and his wife, who made advances to Joseph, it says that he was appointed chief of the household. Now, chief of the household obviously was meant to imply that he was not treated as merely a slave. He was far beyond that. Even when, because of this action, where the wife of his former employer, while she obviously claimed that he tried to rape her, and therefore, hearing this, the husband doesn't even request that he be put to death, and he was a very important individual in Egypt at the time, but no, has him placed in jail, but in a dungeon. And what happens there in the dungeon? The warden of the dungeon decides that Joseph is the one he's got to have as the complete overseer of the dungeon. Again, freedom in places where others might consider themselves who have been imprisoned, have been sold as a slave. But nevertheless, Scripture makes it very clear that no, he did not suffer the inequities. He did not suffer the embarrassment, nor did he suffer the deprivations that came along with imprisonment, with slavery, etc. And there, two of the employees of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, were placed in jail, without going into a lengthy explanation on that. And they both had a dream. And Joseph interpreted the dream for these two people, said one would be released, both would be released. However, one would be put to death. The baker and the wine steward the wine steward. The wine steward was restored to his former position, and the Sar HaOfim, meaning is he was the controller, the lord of all of the baked goods and I guess the food. He was kind of maybe chief chef in charge. He was hung as Joseph had interpreted the dreams. And what happened was it became a reality. And Joseph asked the wine steward that when he is restored to his position and when he is elevated to that level of where he can speak directly to Pharaoh, would he please remember the fact of what he had done for him. And last verse in last week's reading was, nope, the wine steward did not remember Joseph, and in fact, he forgot him. Of course, we have here a dual, or I should say a repetitive statement. Obviously, if the wine steward didn't remember, then obviously he forgot. And yet, in scriptures, it becomes very clear that these two definitions, aside from the fact that they are two different words, to remember and to forget, while they might imply the same thing, nevertheless, Zohar goes on to a lengthy explanation, which, for those of you who do have the Zohar, whether in Hebrew or in English, to see just what the Zohar has to say on that matter, because I want to get to this week's Parsha. Anyway, it says clearly that Joseph remained another 2 years. Another 2 years. Because he did not have faith in himself or the life force of God, but rather was going to depend upon a mortal human being, in this case, the wine steward. And it appears that for whatever reason, that Torah wants to make this very strong point. In other words, for that reason alone, asking someone to do you a favor, a mortal human being who might be in that position to help you, is Torah implying that we should not ask others to help us? And the answer is no, there's nothing wrong with that idea. However, when you come to a point, and unfortunately many of us do come to that point, where we feel we, by and our very own efforts, can in no way succeed, and that we are totally dependent on another individual, it appears very clearly from scriptures that is removing that freedom that we have been given as a birthright given as a birth-given right to exercise a desire, and not only merely to express that desire, feel that desire, but at the same time to learn that we can indeed create our own freedom. And here it appears, because he is in jail now, how could he, on his own, Joseph, seek freedom if not at the help of others? And Scripture makes it very clear that he was, won't use the word punished, but that this as a lesson for us, because did it apply to Joseph? Of course not. If Joseph was Yesod, then he is existing already in another dimension. He is not involved. He is not governed by this level of Malchut. He is Yesod. He's elevated beyond the clutches, the forces of chaos that govern in the world of Malchut. And so, obviously, the lesson here to be taught is that we're not referring to Joseph. We're referring to how Scripture ties this little story around Joseph to indicate that when we can achieve a connection with the flawless universe and we abandon that effort, or we just are simply maybe too lazy to pursue that effort. Maybe it's, in fact, very time consuming, or it's too difficult, and it may be, to change certain physical, natural laws of this universe. And there are many that we have, down through the centuries, down through the millennia, have assumed that these are irrevocable forms of chaos that we cannot overcome. And the answer is no. There is nothing in the way of chaos that is beyond the reach, beyond the grasp of the individual with proper connections, with the opportunities to reach out. Now that we have the Zohar, we have so much information on how we no longer have to be totally dependent upon or even governed by anything and everything that exists on this Malchut level, on this level of existence where we find ourselves. And therefore, the idea here is that no, it didn't refer to Joseph. Joseph, Scripture makes it so obvious that he could have commanded his own ticket, so to speak. So it was far and beyond Joseph that who could be and would be limited by the limitations of the physical reality. No. It is rather a guideline, yardstick, how we can measure. Well, how much do I have to depend on others? How much is required of my efforts to seek my own freedom? If I completely abandon, if I completely give up that responsibility of making certain, that effort of achieving total freedom from chaos by connecting with the world of Zerampin, that flawless universe, which Joseph is that furniture of that wonderful nourishment known as the life force of God. He is our direct link. He is Yesod. Yesod making this contact with Malkuth, the world that we live in. That if we do not achieve the desired results after making every effort, making all the connections necessary to achieve freedom, and we still feel ourselves boxed in within this confine of chaos, pain, and suffering, then of course, if there is somehow how we can alleviate that condition, if there's somebody that we could reach out and ask for a lending hand, of course, Scripture is not frowning upon that kind of effort. But where we have made no effort, but just because it is an accepted rule, you're in jail, you're in chaos, you're in pain and suffering, and it just doesn't seem to be any way out. To take this defeatist attitude, then the price to be paid for that attitude, meaning the doctor said, no way, no way to make or achieve freedom out of that particular illness, that condition, which already there's a prognosis, nothing can be done. This is what the Torah wants to caution us. That remember, there is no such thing, such condition, unless it is so severe. And sometimes, yes, with all of our proper connections, with all of the efforts that others may contribute to the reversal of a condition, sometimes yes, but very rarely will we ever be placed in a position where there is no way out, regardless of the intercessions of others, where or our connections with the light force, which has been done so orderly and properly that we cannot escape because society has accepted these conditions as irreversible. Great lesson. And then it says Pharaoh had two dreams that only Joseph can answer. And then suddenly the wine steward wakes up. I'm not going to go into the dreams. That would take too much time. It's quite simple. And out came Joseph, for the wine steward remembered about what he had done for him in jail. And now he tells Pharaoh. After 2 years later that he believes that we have somebody who is presently sitting in jail that he can interpret and provide a proper interpretation. And so he's released. And what happens? As a result of Joseph's interpretation, which was and went that there would be 7 lean years, and so Joseph was intimating to Pharaoh that it was extremely important that during these 7 fat years to accumulate as much food as possible, so that when the famine did come, there would be sufficient food to supply the entire world. On the surface, and for this, what was the reward for Joseph? He becomes second in command. Now that is totally illogical because, okay, he interpreted a dream, and therefore Pharaoh now divides his kingdom with Joseph on the premise of this of this interpretation, which many of us probably might have come to the same conclusion. But the answer is that once Joseph had achieved that level of Yesod, meaning he had gone out of the realm of Malchut, he had elevated himself beyond the realm of chaos, pain, and suffering, then there was an open ticket to no matter how simple or how slight his contribution to Pharaoh might have been, this was a foreordained story, because in effect what Pharaoh did was place Joseph in charge to become the provider on this physical level for the necessity of the world to continue with sustenance. But this was already foreordained. When Joseph achieved that elevated state of consciousness into what is known as Yesod, meaning he literally bootstrapped himself right up into and out of the realm from chaos into the realm of a flawless universe. Shabbat shalom to everybody.